Hello, everybody. This is Constance from Mysterious Galaxy. I am very excited because tonight we have Richard, who is doing our Instagram takeover today, but we have Richard Farrell is going to be doing an event with us for The Falling Woman, his new book. So I'm going to go ahead and let him take it away. He's going to talk to you about his book and everything. Make sure that if you have any questions that you put them down in that comment section because he'll be answering them. And also, we are very happy he is a local San Diegan author, yay! Which means that we get to offer you guys not only signed, but also personalized books. And we've got the link for that right above the video. So Richard, I will let you go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Constance. She's been taking care of me all day because I've been all lost, screwed up all day. I took over Instagram. I took over the Mysterious Galaxy's Instagram page today and got totally lost in that. And it was kind of a confusing day, but we're good. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thanks for Mysterious Galaxy for hosting this event in this strange time of book launches and book readings. My name is Rich Farrell. I am the author of The One, which is over my shoulder and in my hand. It's my debut novel. It's my first novel. It came out last week. It's almost a week old. It'll be a week old tomorrow. Yeah, this is a really exciting time to be, strange time to be publishing a book and try to make sense of what this looks like. I will do the best I can. I've kicked my kids off their Wi-Fi, and I hopefully don't lose my signal. It's already happened once in one of my virtual events. I'm just, my fingers are crossed, my toes are crossed. We'll see what happens. I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about the inspiration for the book, where it came from, where the idea came from, kind of how it came into being. And then I would do a short reading and then maybe talk a little bit more about what the book's sort of intent is, and then open up for Q&A. I'll be really quick. I won't belabor the point. The biggest thing I would say is if you're here watching this event live, or if you watch it recorded, to support local independent bookstores like Mysterious Galaxy, because they are hanging on by a thread, and we need to buy books from them and support what they do, the great work they're doing. I know Mysterious Galaxy just moved, like just this winter, they moved to a new location, and then the pandemic hit and everything shut down. So it's a great bookstore, and I hope you'll consider buying books from them, or at least spreading the word to your friends to buy books from Mysterious Galaxy, because they do a lot for authors, and you need those bookstores now more than ever. So The Falling Woman is a novel about a plane crash. It's a novel about a strange situation where a woman survives a plane crash. She falls out of an airplane from a very high altitude, like 20,000+ feet, and falls to the roof of a barn and lands in a haystack. And as crazy as that premise sounds, I actually took the concept for this story from real events. There's at least 5 cases of people who've fallen out of airplanes and survived from really high altitudes. I think I was trying to think back recently to where this story premise came from, and I really think it came back to I was in a workshop once, and someone said, "What's your greatest fear?" And I thought about that, and my greatest fear was falling. I have this terrible fear of falling, and I used to be a pilot. And I've jumped out of airplanes, but I have a terrible fear of heights and a terrible fear of falling. And so the combination of my fascination with aviation and my fear of falling merged into this story. It started as a short story. For about 4 or 5 years, I was trying to write this book as a short story, and it didn't work. I couldn't make sense of it as a short story. And I was at a writing conference, and I met with some agents. It was kind of one of those like speed dating things where you meet with agents, and the agents were all saying, "Well, what's your novel about?" And after the second meeting, I realized I had to say something. I said, "Well, I have a novel about a woman who falls out of an airplane and survives." And they seemed interested in a generic sense. And so I said, "I think I could make this a bigger story." And so I started working on this around 2014 timeframe as a longer story, and then I ended up getting an agent for a book of short stories, which hasn't been published yet. And the first thing the agent said to me was, "Do you have a novel?" So I lied again and said, "Yeah, I've got a novel about a woman who falls out of an airplane." But once I had an agent, I knew I had to actually write the damn thing. So I kind of committed to writing this book. And it became a labor of love. It became exploration. It isn't about a plane crash. It really isn't about a woman who falls. It's about what do we do with when life turns us around and makes us think about who we are and why we're here on the planet. And so this woman has this incredible story, and this incredible story of survival. And mostly what she wants is to disappear. And so the story becomes about her disappearance and about this investigator, this young NTSB investigator named Charlie Radford, who's searching for Erin Garrity, the woman who falls. It's not really a spoiler alert. The book is called The Falling Woman. You know she survives, but his initial thought is that it's a hoax, that someone has just made this story up, and so he doesn't want the case, and he goes in search of this woman, and he eventually finds her. And the story is all about what do you do with this incredible miracle? If you've been granted this, and miracle is a loaded term. I don't mean it in sort of a religious way. I mean it in a life-altering way. What do you do with this? And so it's a story about exploring why we do the things we do. I like to say it's a story about certainty and uncertainty. It's not about plane crashes, and I think it took me a while to realize that. And I have this incredible passion for aviation, so I was able to work some of that into the story as well. The main plot is Charlie Radford, this investigator, going in search of and trying to believe this woman's story, and then deciding what to do with it once he does find her. He does eventually find her, again, not giving much away. And then how does he deal with her story? There are these 5 cases. The piece I'm going to read in a minute is this first realization. It's about, I think it's 14 chapters into the book. The first realization for the reader that these other cases exist, and I actually name all 5 cases in this little short reading I'm going to do. When I first discovered them, when I was doing research on the book, on the story, and I first discovered these 5 cases, I didn't believe them. I thought they were urban legends. I thought they were just kind of crazy conspiracy theories. And I did more research and realized these 5 people, 3 of them were in World War II, and then 2 happened in the 1970s, where airplanes came apart in midair. People fell out of the plane and survived. And as I thought about that, how would we in contemporary culture deal with that, with all the social media, with all the intense media pressure on people? How would a person who survived a fall like that, how would they live their lives again? And I think they wouldn't. I was writing this book when the Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 disappeared, and I remember the fascination the public had with a missing plane with no explanation. And it was sort of in the throes of writing this novel, and I thought, like, what if one person had survived that? Like, how instantaneously famous they would become, and what if he didn't want that fame? So that for me was one of the more pressing questions, because this woman wants to disappear, and so that became part of the storyline for me. Let's see, what else was I going to say about the book? I think that gives you a general idea. I'm going to read a short passage. So the structure of the novel starts with a prologue, and then it goes into a backstory that is the Congressional Aviation Subcommittee for Congressional Affairs interviewing the investigator. And what he's doing is he's answering questions because they haven't solved the mystery yet. And so this is like a flash forward moment in the story where the investigator is answering questions about what may or may not have happened. I see a question, so I'm gonna answer the question first. Do you identify with the characters you've written in this book? Are the characters a proxy of you as the author? Yeah, I think so. I think the 2 main characters certainly are Radford, the investigator, is a proxy for my love of flying. When I was training to be a pilot, I found out I had epilepsy and I couldn't fly anymore. So I gave him a similar backstory where his passion to become a pilot was taken away from him at a young age, like mine was. He investigates aircraft accidents. I never did that. I did work in the aviation field after I left, and it really sucks. It was really hard to be a pilot for a while and then get a job where you're doing like the bureaucracy of flying, and the two things don't kind of line up. So I gave him some of that. The falling woman character, Erin Garrity, her character for me came out of a more spiritual place. Like, what are our obligations to, to follow the rules of society? And I think she's kind of a rebel in a lot of ways. So I felt more attachment to her as a character than I did to Radford, even though Radford was like the younger self, my younger self. Garrity was my older self. So that was part of what I struggle with, to kind of unpack these two characters and what they're doing. Yeah. So I'm going to read, and then maybe there'll be some more questions while I read. I have no idea. This could be me and Constance. Maybe no one's even here, and that's okay. It's a Monday night. Who wants to be on Zoom on a Monday night? So for anyone that's here, thank you for coming. I know this is not easy. We live on Zoom and we live online. So I have a great appreciation for anyone who's here, even if it's just Constance. Hi, Constance. I'll just read to you. So this comes chapter 13. I said 14. It was chapter 13. So he's being, my main character, Radford, is being sort of interrogated by a panel of congressmen about this airplane crash, because a year after the crash, they haven't resolved the cause. They don't know if it's terrorism. They don't know if it's a bomb. They don't know if it's, mechanical. I based a lot of the accident on a few real events, one of which was, first off, I should say this. I should always say this. I should start with this. This should be where I start any pitch. Airplanes don't crash anymore. They're very, very, very safe. Like, they're incredibly safe. But there are historical examples of airplanes that have just sort of unexplainably come apart. And so part of the research for this was based on the TWA 800, which blew up over Long Island, and there was no explanation. And so all of a sudden, when this was like around 89 or 90, this plane blew up, the 747 blew up over Long Island Sound. And there are all these crazy conspiracy theories about what could have caused it. And so that informed my research. And then this Malaysia 370 flight informed my research. So there was this sort of calamitous interest in airplane crashes, which I had as a kid, which I had as a young adult. And so that was part of the backstory as well. So let me read this, and then maybe we'll have some more questions by the end. I'm just sort of reading the chat too. So, okay. It says there are people here. So I'm glad it's just not Constance and I, because I've been kind of bugging her all day. So I'm glad it's just not her and I. So this is chapter 13 from the following moment, and the title of the chapter is the U.S. House of Representatives panel investigating Pointer Airlines Flight 795 second session. Radford clears his throat. An aide delivers another pitcher of cold water, and he immediately fills the empty glass. He takes a sip, glancing down at the detailed notes. The report was that they'd found a passenger alive, he says. What did you do upon hearing this news? I commandeered a state cop in his car and raced toward the barn in Goddard, where she was said to have been found. At that moment, Mr. Radford, what did you think you'd encounter when you reached the barn? The details were sparse at best, he says. In those early hours, very little provided context. You grope about in the dark for a long time. That's why we don't speculate. That's why we gather evidence. Answer the question, sir. What did you expect to find? What did you think you were walking into? A woman was found alive in a barn, he says, along with debris. I didn't know why the assumption was that she'd fallen from the airplane. The story made no sense. I assumed the woman was injured on the ground in the barn. He doesn't tell them that his second thought was that someone played a hoax. He avoids using the word hoax in front of the Congressional Subcommittee for Aviation Affairs. He hopes to keep the word hoax out of the public record, since the resolution of this story itself remains in doubt. He wants to provide no headlines for the evening news. He won't say the word, not to these men and women, even if that was the exact word that ran through his head on the way to the barn. So you approach the barn with skepticism. I tried to approach the barn the way I approached any other piece of wreckage, he says. Whatever I found would be part of the story, and whoever was alive had a story to tell. My job was to ask the right questions. On a screen behind the congressman, A photo appears, an aerial shot of the farm, the now famous red clapboard barn center left, a few dozen acres of feed corn, more rows of soy, a modest-sized ranch house, 2 huge bur oak trees. Other photos are projected onto the screen. Open barn doors, a John Deere tractor parked inside, balers, shelves stuffed with tools and chemicals. Radford remembers walking past the traffic jam of emergency vehicles to even get to the barn. He remembers the firemen, the cops, the sheer chaos of that moment, and everyone looking to him for an explanation. They had all answered an emergency call, but apparently the woman was no longer there when any of them arrived. Then another photo appears. Shep Ellsworth in his bushy ponytail, tattooed forearms, standing next to Radford, both men in blue NTSB windbreakers, staring up at the barn's roof. Just over their shoulders, the dark sky and threatening storms. This photo appeared on the front page of the New York Times. In the distance, Radford can almost see, again, the lightning flashes. Mr. Radford, what happened next? I went into the barn, he says. More than 20 uniformed men and women were inside, cops, firemen, paramedics. Even now, over a year later, Radford remembers the town names on the back of the firemen's coats: Murdoch, Cheney, Goddard, Kingsman. The final photo now appears behind the congressman. This one Radford took with his own phone's camera. A huge jagged hole between the 2 rafters in the ceiling, splinters of wood and light, clouds moving past the open timbers. Was the woman still there? No, Radford says. They'd taken her to the hospital. How badly was she hurt? Apparently, a number of abrasions, he says. No significant trauma. As I said, they took her to the hospital. There's a long pause before the next question is asked, this one from an Alabama congressman. Until now, this man has been quiet. Radford recognizes the man from television. He is old, black, with a ring of bone-white hair. The man's jowls are wide, and he is hard to understand at first, the thick Alabama drawl, an old man's croaky voice. Radford thinks the congressman marched with King. He may have even been in Memphis. Mr. Radford, thank you for being here today. Let's get to the point. Did you believe the story about the falling woman? Radford stares up at the man. It is the first good question of the hearing, the right question. He doesn't mean to insert a dramatic pause, but one follows the congressman's question while Radford registers its implications. Belief is not part of an investigation, Radford says. Never try to be smarter than the evidence. This is how we work. Mr. Radford, the Alabama congressman says, who is Alan Mcgee? A murmur rises in the room. Radford admires this congressman's thoroughness. He would like to thank the man for doing his homework. Staff Sergeant Alan Mcgee, Radford says. Can you tell us about Sergeant Mcgee? Mcgee was a tail gunner on an American B-17 in World War II, Radford says. In 1943, while on a bombing mission over occupied France, Mcgee's plane took flak and caught fire. Radford remembers reading about the story. The details seemed fake, an urban legend propagated on the internet. At first, he could find no hard evidence to verify his claims, but he also couldn't debunk the story's truth. Finally, after hours of digging through old news clippings online, he found the original article from Stars and Stripes. What happened to Sergeant Mcgee? He bailed out of his plane from 22,000 feet, Radford says, without a parachute. The congressman nods. Others pass notes to their interns. Mcgee, Radford says, fell through the glass roof of a train station in Saint-Nazaire, France. He survived. When the German soldiers found him, he'd suffered little more than a few abrasions and broken bones. Radford hears the cameras and reporters coming to life. What did Mcgee's story represent to them? A precedent? Evidence that such a fall could occur? And who is Julianne Kepke? Radford smiles. Miss Kepke fell from a plane in Peru. The plane was struck by lightning above 10,000 feet. She was a teenager at the time. I think it was 1971. She lived too? She fell into a tree, Radford says, climbed down and then stumbled around in the rainforest for 11 days. She only broke her collarbone. She published a book about it. A murmur spreads in the hearing room. The Alabama congressman then asks about Vesna Vulovich, Nicholas Alcamede, and Ivan Chizov, men and women who'd survived falls from airplanes coming apart in midair. The congressman is smart, Radford thinks. He wants to buy the man a beer. Instead, he shares details about each case, cases he's come to know well. So I'll ask again, the congressman says, did you believe her story? I didn't want to believe it, Radford says, but the more I looked, the more of these stories I found, the more I considered it plausible. And you decided to do what with this information? I decided, Radford says, to keep an open mind. This is what the job demands. I let the possibility exist. What possibility is that, sir? The congressman asks. The possibility of the impossible. So for me, this particular section was really important, kind of a geeky little moment for me, because I wanted to insert these 5 actual authentic cases of people who'd survived free falls into the book. And so without being heavy-handed, without just sort of narrating, I had to think of a way dramatically to put this in. And so this congressional subcommittee hearing was where I did that. And those 5 cases I named are all actual people, actual cases of these crazy stories of people who fell out of airplanes and survived. The woman who wrote a book, this Julianne Kepke, wrote a book. She's a biologist, and she wrote a book, a memoir about this. And what was fascinating to me when I read this book was that she only spent about half of a page on the free fall itself. Most of her story was about her survival in the jungle, and so it became this sort of fascination with these people who had these crazy stories and then just wouldn't talk about it. They would not engage with why this happened, how they survived. So that became sort of a point of fascination for me as a writer. And I wanted to insert that reality into this sort of fictional book. And in some ways to give the story plausibility, so it didn't seem like a fantastical story. But in other ways, just to sort of honor these 5 people who had this incredible experience of surviving, falling from unimaginable heights and surviving with really minor injuries, or compared to what could have happened. Let's see. I might have some questions. I'm going to go to my questions, so bear with me. Let's see. I see Cassie. Hi, Cassie. I can't believe you came. She asked, Cassie's a friend of mine from San Diego. She asked how much of it, I assume it's that, Cassie, how much of your time was spent writing this book versus actually researching. I did the bare minimum amount of research because the story itself had so many demands. I mean, I did a lot of research. I'm not going to say I didn't, but for me, it was more a narrative story. And I wanted the research to support the story I was trying to tell. I shared some pictures on Mysterious Galaxy's Instagram page today of some of the books I read. There isn't a lot of NTSB investigators by their nature are kind of tight-lipped. So there isn't a lot out there. They don't talk about their work. They just do the work. And so that was interesting to me. There's a ton of information about airplane crashes online that's available. Planes are very safe. They weren't that safe 20 years ago. They're much, much safer now. So some of that fed into the research, but more or less research was secondary to actually trying to figure out who these characters were and what the story was. Lauren says, I'm almost done with the book. It's a page turner. Thank you, Lauren. I really like it and have learned a lot about aviation. If your book were returned to mini series or movie, who would you like to see play the characters? Oh, that's a great question. I have no idea. No clue. I had, I don't know. It's a great, Lauren, you stumped me. I don't have an answer to that question. I feel like the characters could be anyone, because part of what I wanted to write was ordinary characters plucked from real life. So I see these 2 main characters as just regular people that had this extraordinary thing happen to them, and they had to deal with that. So that was sort of, for me, the motivation for it. Meryl Streep. Can I just say Meryl Streep? Meryl Streep. Why wouldn't I say Meryl Streep? Gwen says, hi, Gwen. I have a trenchant work. It must be Gwen from Vermont College if she knows this term. A trenchant work ethic. At any point that you think the novel was not going to work and consider giving up, how did you get out of your head enough to finish the work? Yeah, geez. every day, most days. The hardest moment for me, to share like a personal writing anecdote, was I'd sent it to my agent in the spring, and I didn't hear from her for a while, and I really convinced myself that she hated it, and she didn't know how to tell me that she hated it. So about 2 months into it, I got a message. I was with a friend in Vermont. She was at a grad school. I think Whitney's here. Hi, Whitney, if you're here. And she had her first day of grad school, and I was there, sort of just dropping her off. And that's not true. I was a grad assistant, so got the dates wrong. But it was in the cradle of where I learned how to write. And I got this message from my agent. She wanted to talk to me, and I was completely convinced she was going to dump me. She was going to tell me that the book sucks. You suck. Go do something else. And that was probably the lowest point of it. I had no confidence. And then how did I keep going? I don't know. I wish I had an answer, but it was terrible. It's an awful experience being a first-time writer. It really is. It's kind of bad. Let's see. I'm going to keep going. I don't want to be all belaboring my misery as the starving artist misery. The question is, in your research in this book, was there any PTSD that survivors had from surviving such an intense event? Yeah, it's a great question. There's 2 other books that I've read that have come out about plane crashes, and all 3 of our books deal with survivor's guilt, PTSD, the sort of numbness that occurs after. The other 2 books, I'll just name them. Everyone probably knows. In Napolitano's book, Dear Ever, that did really well this spring. And then I read a really cool book by a guy named Ry Curtis called Kingdom Tide, and he deals a slightly different take on the process, but it was a sole survivor of a plane crash. And all 3 of us were dealing with this, like, how do you live with the survivor's guilt? That was a big part of it. For me, my character, Erin, the falling woman, was trying to understand what were her obligations to her life before, and what were her obligations to herself as a human being on the planet. And I think that's one of the things I wanted to put on the page dramatically. Hi, Joy. I'm assuming these. So there are names of people coming up. I'm just seeing the questions. I assume that's Joy from my writing workshop from before. Hi, Joy. Joy says, "Hi, Rich. Was there anything editors and publishing agent told you to change that you didn't want to? Were there some revisions you struggled with? If so, an example?" Yeah, I struggled with the ending of the book a lot. I wrote it several different ways. My agent changed it. So I wrote it one way. My agent didn't like it. She wanted to have a little bit more of an uplifting ending. So I changed it to sort of, I won't say meet her. She wasn't heavy-handed. She wasn't like forcing me, but she just gave me suggestions. So I changed the ending once. I wasn't crazy about it, but I'm like, well, it's going to sell. I mean, I'm going to be honest. If it's going to sell, let's sell the damn book. And then my editor at Algonquin got it, and he read it, and then he said, no, I don't like this ending. Let's go. So he kind of pushed me back to the original ending. And so there was a little bit of tug of war with that, going back and forth. There were a few scenes that I wrote that I thought were really cool that my editor ended up suggesting I cut, and he was right, but at the time I was like, oh, I like the scene. Why do I want to cut the scene? And some of the structure of the book had to change that way. But in most cases, I was very happy with what everyone suggested. And it's a tug of war. My editor at Algonquin said, he said, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm trying to see the book as a reader. He said, I'm a really good reader. So I see the book as a reader will see the book. And that was super helpful for me. It sort of shifted my focus from, whatever my intent was to write the book, to try to see it as how a reader would see the book. So that was a big part of it for me. Another question says, what was the editing process like, and how long did that take after you submitted their manuscript? So I submitted the book to my agent in the spring. She worked on it a little bit over the summer. Then it went to the publisher, got picked up, and then it was about 2 years of edits with them. Not every day. It was just small stuff. We kind of went back and forth. The copy edits were pretty intense. It's kind of like a boom bust thing. Like you get you're like working, and then you get nothing for a month, and you think that they've forgotten you, and then they come back with all these edits. So it was kind of a fascinating process to do that. But I'm geeky. I like editing. I'll admit I like to edit, and it's like when someone's reading me with intensity. And the very best thing to have as a writer, I learned this through this process. The very best thing to have as a writer is to have really good readers. It's terrifying, but it's also really humbling to realize that the writer puts in this work on behalf of the readers. And so when you have good readers, you feel like, oh, there are people paying attention in the world, and that makes a huge difference. Barry says, is it a spoiler to say why he's testifying before Congress? No, I don't think it is a spoiler, Barry. Thanks. It's a great question. Again, this came from the Malaysia era Flight 370. You will never, I'm going to tell you, you don't find out why the plane crashes. I have, in my head, I have speculation and reasons, but a year passed and they don't have an answer to why the plane crashed. I kind of wanted that uncertainty. So he's been called before Congress because they've invested all this time and energy and money, and this falling woman story is sort of distracted. It seems like it's distracted from the actual airplane investigation, the accident investigation. But I wanted to keep that uncertainty alive because I think that happens sometimes. We're so convinced we want answers, and when we don't have answers, that to me is a dramatic question. It's more compelling. So yeah. I have a question from Gwen. Says, do you think that the fallers go unconscious as they fall? Do they remember much? Are they hiding something like sabotaging the plane? I think a lot of them do pass out. So interestingly, one of the inspirations for this falling part of the story was from a James Dickey poem called Falling. It's the epigraph of the book, where he describes a woman descending and falling, and she falls out of an airplane and she dies. But they don't always go unconscious, or if they do, they kind of go in and out. There's enough air at 22,000 feet roughly to, you can't live forever there, but you could live for a few minutes there. And so there's a sort of this descent process. But I think the shock of it would be more interesting, or more a part of how they process the information. I don't necessarily know that her description in the book is accurate. I think it's how the story she sort of told herself. But like I said, I couldn't imagine it. I could not imagine doing that. So Manny says, how much of your time was spent editing? 90% of my life is spent editing, Manny. I think that's all I do is edit. I wish I didn't have to edit so much, but that's what I do. But yeah, I mean, honestly, like the drafts go quickly. The editing is where the time comes in. Michelle asks, how much of your teaching informed your writing and vice versa? I teach a lot of writing classes in San Diego, and I think I had a really influential teacher in grad school who said, don't teach something that you don't want to learn. So if you're going to spend your time teaching it, make sure it's something you're interested in. And that's been how I teach. So I love the craft. I love talking about craft. And so teaching classes, teaching workshops, helps me think about my own writing. I try not to bring my own writing into the workshop, but I do love, trying to understand the craft of writing and to be able to explain it to writers that are studying the craft. So I think on that level, it does make a difference. I definitely, I get a lot out of the teaching because it makes me sort of reflect on the craft of what I'm doing, the practice of what I'm doing. Molly asks, what suggestions do you have for beginning writers who are trying to publish their first book? I have one word for you, Molly. It's patience. This book legitimately took me 10 years. I have a really fun story. I tell, I was at a sort of a hoity-toity writing conference called Breadloaf in Vermont, and was sort of humbled to be there and, really out of place. And my roommate, we had this really cool, like, so it was 5 guys, but for some reason they put us off campus. We had this really cool cabin off the main campus of Breadloaf, and I was living with this guy, and his first book was coming out like that. I think it was that fall or that winter, and we were in this little like lofty space, like sleeping, in these 2 beds, like 2 little bunk beds, and I said, hey Sean, like, tell me the truth. I said, how long does it take to really, write a book? And he said 10 years. He said it takes 10 years. And for me, that his name is Sean Prentice. He has a great book. It was called Finding Abby. It was a really cool book about this. He went in search of Edward Abbey's great nonfiction book, went in search of Edward Abbey. Was an environmentalist, and he went in search of his grave. But Sean said it took him 10 years to really get that first book out the door. And that, for me, helped me take the pressure off. it sounds horrible. It sounds awful. It sounds like, oh God, how can you take 10 years to write a book? But I heard so much bad information about how long it takes. Some people do it faster. You know, if you've been writing your whole life, maybe it'll be faster. But for me, it took 10 years. It took 10 solid years to get something that was maybe worthy of being published, you know. And I wasn't working on it every day. I don't want to exaggerate, but 10 years of just writing and, you know, kind of failing a lot. So what am I currently working on? I'm currently working on the next novel. I'm currently working on a bunch of short stories that I really like that I want to get out into the world. I'm currently working on a flash fiction piece. I'm currently working on potentially a memoir. Yeah, I'm currently working. I'll say that. The second novel they say is the hard one. I don't want to believe that. I'm trying to hope that's not the case. But I've had a lot of fun in the pre-publication time. There's been a lot of time to write. So I have been fairly invested in this second novel, and we'll see where it goes. Some days I think it's going to be fine. Some days I think it's going to suck. So I don't know. Not sure. What was the most challenging scene for you to write, and which one brought you the most joy? I will answer the second part of that question first. The most joy to write was the ending of the book. I really liked the ending. It took me a while to figure out how to end the book and where to end the book, but I still like the ending of the book a lot. I like what it does. The most challenging scene to write was probably the middle scenes, like to sort of keep the plot interesting and keep the storyline going. But I knew where I was trying to get to. So the middle scenes of the book were the hardest ones to write, and to balance the technical information with the narrative, and you know, and try to keep the reader interested in the story, but also provide enough accurate technical information that you know it was true to what potentially happen in an investigation. I know it's not entirely accurate, but it's potentially true to what would happen in a major airplane investigation. So yeah. How did I land my agent? I can't tell you. It's a deep, dark secret. I can't tell you that, Barry. I landed my agent by chance. I sent my book of short stories to a good friend to help me read them. And from some act of grace and benevolence, she, on her own, without any prompting from me, sent the short stories to her agent. And her agent called me on a Friday. I was on. You asked, so I'm going to tell you the story. Too bad, you can deal with it now. I'll never forget it. I was driving to a bowling alley party with my son for someone's birthday. And this woman calls me from New York, and I pick up the phone, and she goes, "Hi, Rich. This is Marley, my agent." And she said, "I read your short stories. I really like them. I'd like to talk to you more." And that was one of the coolest moments of my life. But then 2 days later, she called me back and said, "I really can't represent you with short stories. Do you have a novel?" So it's kind of like, that's kind of the process, you know. And then she called me back 2 days after that and said, "I'll represent you, but I want to push you on the novel." And so, yeah, it's kind of crazy. So I see end of questions. I think we're over time.
We are. Hi, this is Constance.
Hi, Constance. Thanks.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Rich. It was awesome to hear you answer all of these questions. Thank you so much too to everyone who joined and participated with us and asked all these great, amazing questions. And just to, as a reminder, we do have signed, not bookplates, but actual signed books for sale, where we've got the link up there. But Rich, I will let you go ahead and say goodbye to everyone before I shut it off. But goodbye, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Constance. Thanks and get your books through Mysterious Galaxy. It's a great bookstore. Thanks so much.